We found that the forest does not just listen. It speaks back and it knows our names. We departed Atlanta under cover of a pre-dawn sky. That Friday in late September of that year, I was 24 burning daylight hours at the rail yard and hoarding every single dime for tuition. The city had grown suffocating, a cage of concrete, so when James proposed a retreat, I agreed. We craved isolation, a stretch of river to cast lines, bitter coffee and the silence of pines. There were 4 of us packed into the vehicle, with James behind the wheel of his Chevrolet. He guarded it like a treasure, carrying a folding knife and keeping his leather boots polished clean. He spoke of his army days with more fondness than his current employment acting as our leader. Beside him was Robert, a decade our senior. A man of few words, rubbing his jaw often. In the rear seat I sat with Mary, James's cousin, who observed the passing asphalt with focus. We had packed a canvas shelter, bed rolls, a cast-iron skillet, and a cooler filled with food supplies. Robert brought his tackle and bait, while James brought a used rifle for any trouble we met. Mary asked what sort of trouble he envisioned, but James just shrugged, insisting it was better prepared. The highway out of the metro area was smooth, but soon the pavement surrendered to graveled dirt. By mid-morning, the Chevrolet was bouncing over rutted dirt. As dust drifted through the open windows there, James seemed revitalized back in the country, pointing out dilapidated barns and bends in the road ahead. Robert listened in silence while Mary remained quiet, tracking every fence line as if cataloging escape routes. We halted once at a roadside general store, where the proprietor was an elder with silver hair. He asked our destination, and James mentioned the river flats near Miller Bridge, causing the man pauses. The old man remarked that the area was awfully still for this season. A warning in voice. James replied that the silence was exactly what we were chasing, but the man advised a fire. He delivered the warning like a weather report, plain and factual, telling us never to walk alone. James paid and thanked him, but as we exited, he chuckled about old-timers trying to spook, ha 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 ha. Back in the car, Robert did not join the laughter, asking what the old man had implied. James dismissed it as talk of wild dogs, but Mary noted the shopkeeper looked genuinely afraid then. I kept my mouth shut, unwilling to tarnish the mood before we even arrived at the river. We reached the river bend at high noon, parking where the trail vanished and hauling our gear downhill. The path was a deer trail worn into red clay, leading to a river with swift currents. The banks were choked with cane and thicket, and the atmosphere smelled of damp earth and decay. No motors, no chatter, just the rushing water and the wind blowing through the canopy above us. I recall the sensation that we had crossed a threshold into a domain that could swallow men. We selected a clearing beneath 2 towering pines, where James and Robert erected the tent for shelter. Mary arranged river stones into a hearth and positioned the coffee pot. Moving with efficient grace, there we lunched on cold cuts and bread in the shade, before Robert took his rod to water. James hiked upstream with the rifle, claiming he needed to find a prime casting spot for fish. Mary and I remained at camp, where she instructed me on knotting a line despite my protests. We discussed the city and trivialities, and she asked about my mother and my night school plans. By late afternoon, the heat broke, and Robert shouted that he had hooked 2 bream from water. James returned with a sack of catfish, and we gutted the catch on a flat rock then. While rinsing my blade, I heard a sound from the opposing bank that resembled a man's shout. "Hey!" It drifted over the water and ceased, making James stand rigid as he listened to the noise. Mary asked if we had company, but Robert squinted at the dense foliage and saw nothing there. James decided it must be another angler downstream, so we resumed our work despite the heavy feeling. We hauled the fillets back to the fire, where James salted them in the skillet over flames. The aroma of frying fish mingled with wood smoke, as we gorged ourselves and watched the water turn. After the meal, James walked into the darkness to relieve himself, but returned quickly with a pale face. He told us he had found fresh prints in the muddy, just beyond the firelight near trees. Robert asked if they were deer, but James described them as too massive and splayed wider than. He said they looked like goat tracks, prompting Robert to investigate with him while Mary asked questions. Robert confirmed the tracks were fresh, leading toward the water before looping back into the timber there. We fed the fire logs in shifts. Mary retired to her bedroll and Robert lay by coals. James and I sat up whispering about hunting legends, and he mentioned a tale about the Goatman. He grinned to scare me, but his gaze kept darting past the flames into the void there. James said the river folk blamed missing livestock on a thing that walked on 2 hooves silently. Some claimed it observed campfires from the periphery, or drew closer when groups argued or separated there. I asked if he bought into it, but James shrugged, admitting he had never seen more signs. Mary poked her head out, scolding us. So James apologized, repeating the name Goatman with theatrical emphasis. When my turn came to sleep, I removed my boots and sprawled near the heat by fire. James insisted on the first watch, a sighting habit, while Robert faced the woods motionless in the night. I drifted into a restless doze, until a new sound sliced through the night directly behind me. It was a single, clipped word that sounded enough like my name to seize my heart. Then, Tom. My eyes snapped open, realizing the sound originated from beyond the light and the tree line. There. James turned sharply, gripping the rifle while tapping my leg to ask if I had heard that. Robert sat up groggy, but before we could answer, the sound repeated with the identical pitch. Then it was like a needle skipping on vinyl, only this time it did not say my name. It said James, and then Mary called from the tent, asking what we were doing in there. James, what are you doing in there?" Her voice cut through the air, but the voice in the trees lacked substance beyond the name. A Caucasian man named James in his early 40s stood facing the blackness, sweeping his flashlight beam across the trees. But the light caught bark. Robert circled the tent, inspecting the ground, then returned shaking his head, with no prints and other signs. Mary emerged, pulling her sweater tight, looking between us and the forest, asking again what had happened. James lied, saying it was likely voices carrying from downriver, claiming our minds were playing tricks. Then we stayed up late. As James kept the weapon close and Mary piled wood on the fire. Eventually exhaustion won, so James agreed to a rotation, while Robert took the rifle against a pine. I slept in fragments, waking once to the crunch of Robert's boots, patrolling the perimeter of camp. When I woke again, the sky was gray, the fire was ash, and an elderly African-American man named James was feeding coals. Mary stepped out, rubbing her face, asking if anything occurred, but Robert pointed to the rear camp. In the sand, fresh tracks appeared deeper than before, stomping over where we had walked at dusk. Robert said they made a circle, meaning whatever it is walked around us all night. While sleeping, James crouched examining the earth, reiterating that these were not deer, because the edges were razor-sharp. He stood tracing the path of the tracks, moving away from us toward a dense thicket there. Mary demanded we leave, saying the trip was ruined, and James frowned but suggested breakfast before departing. Robert went to the river to wash and I followed, kneeling to scrub the grit from hands. Robert stiffened, murmuring that it was something rancid, something living that never cleaned itself in the water. We walked back in silence to find Mary cooking eggs with jerky motions, eyes darting to trees after eating. Mary insisted we leave, listing the warning, the tracks, the mimicry, and the smell. Then James argued, citing daylight, accusing her of letting ghost stories rot her brain, but Robert intervened. Then I capitulated, suggesting we wait until afternoon to avoid splitting the group, so we stayed at camp. We cleaned up and James proposed to scout inland to track the intruder, while Robert forbade splitting. We compromised so James and I would scout a short distance, while Robert and Mary waited there. We entered the trees following the hoof prints as the ground rose and the undergrowth closed in. The tracks became distinct, where needles were swept aside, and the stride remained impossibly long for man. James stopped spanning his fingers over a print, whispering that the split was wide and weight immense. My stomach churned at the freshness of the dirt. Noting on the walls of the print stood firm. I suggested we return and James agreed, but cast one last look into the gloom before walking. As we neared the river, the air changed and that sour, heavy reek returned suffocatingly thick there. When the water appeared, Robert and Mary stood by the bank rigid, staring at us as emerged. Mary pointed to the far bank, saying something had moved through the brush, a tall and upright figure. We stood as four statues, staring across the water where the far bank was still but heavy. Around noon, James proposed to walk downstream to find a better site, and Robert suggested the path. We struck the tent, and when the packs were loaded, we marched downstream in single-file caution. The river was on our left, and the soft midi left a clear trail, which I hated. As I lifted my boot, something cracked in the brush to the right. Loud and heavy wood? We froze, and James swung the rifle toward the sound, as the smell hit us like fog. "Come out!" James raised the weapon and shouted for it to come out. But the brush remained still silent. Robert signaled a retreat, and we backed up step by slow step until we reached a wider section. We pressed on without words, feeling the sensation of eyes on our skin as a physical weight. At a river bend, the land opened into a clearing, so we dropped packs in a defensive circle. Robert pointed to the far bank, thinking he saw movement, but then we heard a knock behind. It was one sharp, deliberate rock. Then another knock came closer, and then another closer still, forcing us to grab our gear, run. We walk faster. "30 yards later, a new sound emerged. Heavy footsteps in the leaves behind us, matching our pace. James hissed for us to stop, and the footsteps stopped instantly, leaving us standing in the silence. A breeze carried the smell thicker now, and James pointed to a rock cluster where we ducked 20 yards back. The branches parted, revealing a tall shape with dark fur and legs bent backward. It stood partially obscured with curved horns, watching us with a calculated stillness that was worse aggression. James whispered to move, and we rose with eyes locked on the trees as the creature remained. We moved faster, but the footsteps returned the moment we hit the slope, coming in heavy pairs. It was toying with the distance, and when we reached the camp, the air was charged fear. The trail was steep, twisting through roots, and when we reached a plateau, fresh tracks cut across. James knelt, saying they were less than an hour old, meaning it had been ahead of us. Mary whispered to run, but Robert said running might lead us right into it, so we climbed. A scrape on bark sounded ahead, a slow drag of heavy limbs. So James signaled left open. The car was 50 yards away under the pines. But then a shape stepped out between trees. Legs bent backward, ending in hooves. Torso thick with dark fur and eyes glowing red in shade. It watched us with no sound and no posture shift, causing Mary to gasp and James aim. The creature took a slow, heavy step that shook the ground, and an elderly Caucasian man named James screamed for it stop. Stop! It took another step. So James fired the rifle, and the gunshot echoed violently through the woods. The creature jerked back but did not fall, stepping into the shadows and vanishing without a sound. We rushed the car as the woods remained dead silent, and James shoved us inside the vehicle, floored it, tires spinning, then gripping as we shot up the dirt road, blurring the trees. Halfway up the hill, a massive blow struck a tree trunk behind us, then another crack closer. James drove like a madman, until we hit the main road and turned toward civilization without slowing. Mary whispered she saw its eyes tracking us even after the bullet hit, terrifying us all more. James pulled over miles later at an abandoned feed store, leaning on the hood, sweating and asking. Robert said it jerked but did not stumble, and James muttered that a 30-30 drops a bear. James straightened, saying we do not talk about this, because no one in town will believe our story. We agreed and drove into town, where the familiar mailboxes and fences looked alien to our eyes. We stopped at a diner for coffee, and I told him it did not attack. It tested. I said it felt intelligent. It was playing with us back there. We left and dropped Mary off. Then Robert, before James drove me home and grabbed my arm. He whispered that the shot did not bleed. It just learned, and I went inside the room it learned. Morning came, and I stepped onto my porch to find a fresh, deep hoofprint in dirt. I knelt, scanning the yard, and realized it had followed the car and moves faster than we. James and Robert arrived, and I told them, "It is not attacking now, it is waiting me." It called my name first before we saw the tracks, and clearly it had stood watching Window Tom. We held a vigil in my living room, and at 2 a.m, a single knock. James stayed but became a stranger. Robert moved away and Mary left the state to escape fear. I never saw it again, but I know it is out there watching and waiting in silence. Years later, I drove to the edge of those woods, looked at the tree line and felt it let me go to prove. If you have ever felt eyes on you in the woods, hit that like button for us. Let the winds of thought carry your story in the comments, and tell us if you would run